There's been so many theories out there about what happened to Nancy. And it's interesting with Pima County Sheriff Chris Nanos, in his last interview he did, he said that they even have a theory that they've had for a while, but he wouldn't say what it was. There was some reporting weeks ago that the Sheriff's Department theory, the working theory, may have been a burglary gone wrong.
Some cold cases lose momentum, not through lack of evidence, but because the public noise simply vanishes. News crews depart, the headlines dry up, and reporters inevitably move to the next tragedy. We assume forensic work continues behind closed doors, hidden from the public eye. We assume someone is still demanding answers and pushing for justice. The reality is that momentum often stalls because the people in charge have stopped pushing. Time distorts investigations, creating a distance that slowly erodes the initial sense of urgency. That distance makes it easier to accept that some questions will remain forever unanswered. It becomes simpler to reallocate resources and file the folders away. You convince yourself that everything was exhausted. That is exactly what happened to Nancy Guthrie. At first, Nancy Guthrie's disappearance gripped the public and shook the entire community. It carried those haunting details: a woman vanished, no remains located, and no clear suspects identified. Her family was left stranded in a growing silence, surrounded by questions that only got louder with time. Online forums buzzed, and news stations tracked every update while tips poured into the station. There was a palpable sense of urgency, a feeling that a major breakthrough was imminent. Then, the momentum died. The case did not end, it just settled into stillness. This stillness looks like peace to outsiders, but it feels like total abandonment to the family. While the world moved on, the Guthrie family remained trapped in a reality where Nancy was still gone. The perpetrator remained at large, while the investigation quietly slipped out of the spotlight. That is when Brian Entin returned. To understand this case, you must understand who he is. Entin does not chase easy headlines or cheap clicks when a story is trending. He is a veteran journalist who focuses on the details that everyone else has ignored. He revisits cases because he suspects something critical has been overlooked by the authorities. Usually, his instincts are correct. When he returned to the Guthrie case, he had no new evidence. He did not have a secret witness or a sudden confession from a primary suspect. He arrived with something clinical and patient. He arrived with a single question. It was not the obvious question of who killed her that had been asked for years. That query had failed 1,000 times. He brought a slower, more forensic line of inquiry. He asked, what part of this story does not fit? It sounds simple, but it is incredibly difficult. When you are buried in an investigation, seeing the gaps in the logic becomes nearly impossible. You are blinded by timelines and physical evidence, losing the ability to see the missing pieces. You focus on the data you have and build a narrative strictly around those facts. Eventually, you stop noticing what is missing from the picture entirely. Brian noticed the absence. He did not come back looking for a specific person of interest. He was not building a new theory. He was returning to the start with fresh eyes. He wanted to find the exact moment where the official narrative stopped making logical sense. Homicide detectives will tell you that stalled cases are rarely due to a lack of data. Usually, it is because the existing information was misread or misinterpreted early on. Falsehoods are accepted as facts, and open questions are treated as settled matters. Those settled assumptions become a wall that blocks any further progress. Everything is built on that flawed foundation, and the truth remains hidden behind it. Brian Entin was willing to tear down that foundation. He did not start with suspects. He began with cold logic and the basic shape of the reported events. The sequence of reported events finally aligned when scrutinized with cold objectivity and forensic honesty. Here, the investigation shifted focus once you stop hunting for a name and start identifying what details do not belong. Obvious truths emerge that were previously ignored, and tiny, overlooked anomalies suddenly demand a much closer tactical inspection. Minor discrepancies seem trivial alone, yet together they form a pattern, revealing the rough outline of a larger image. This image remains incomplete, but Brian's initial discovery lacked any theatrical flair. It was far from a definitive smoking gun. Think of it as a splinter, a microscopic irritation out of place that constantly grated against the official narrative limits. While it did not dismantle the entire police report, Brian realized the entire scene appeared far too sterile and tidy. Understand the gravity of that real violence is inherently chaotic, defined by sheer panic and a total lack of order. Scenarios collapse and critical facts blur because no violent encounter ever follows a script or meets any preconceived expectations. Raw reality is volatile, and humans are flawed, meaning there is always natural friction that disrupts even the tightest plans. Mistakes are inevitable, and even the most methodical crimes leave behind some trace of the entropy that occurs during violence. When Brian scrutinized the specific timeline regarding the night Nancy Guthrie vanished, the official logs began looking far too perfect. Every recorded action was suspiciously fluid, the timing was overly surgical, and the movements of the parties involved felt artificial. The progression lacked any natural interruptions, suggesting a high-level plan carried out with impossible precision and zero tactical errors. Actual human encounters are jagged, filled with awkward gaps and minor failures that leave a trail of forensic evidence behind. Those traces were missing here, and when timing is that flawless and execution is that controlled, it signals something artificial. This perfection indicates two possibilities. Either the provided statement is false, or the individual responsible was not acting on impulse. They were not seizing a sudden opportunity. They had mentally rehearsed this sequence dozens of times before ever setting foot outside. Visualizing every movement before the strike, Brian suspected this premeditated focus was the only explanation for such surgical precision. This realization fundamentally altered the investigation. If this was not a moment of sudden madness, then we are looking at calculation. If the timing and movements were truly that uninterrupted, then the person behind the crime was no desperate, panicked amateur. This was no stranger walking into an unknown scenario, but someone with a deep, tactical understanding of the environment. They knew the terrain intimately more than a casual passerby, or someone who had merely scouted the area from a distance once. This individual was a frequent presence, having studied the geography meticulously enough to anticipate every obstacle and advantage on site. They mastered the local rhythm, tracking exactly when the streets were packed and precisely when they went dead quiet. They memorized the physical layout and every available exit, cataloging normal activity so they could blend in while identifying potential threats. This level of expertise is known as environmental familiarity, a critical forensic marker that drastically narrows the list of potential suspects. It effectively eliminates the infinite pool of random strangers and points directly toward a person with specific, localized geographical knowledge. You stop looking for an anomaly and start searching for someone with a tangible, verifiable reason for knowing that specific location. This does not automatically imply a personal acquaintance of Nancy's, such as a direct neighbor, a colleague, or a close friend. This localized knowledge could stem from a standard delivery route, a local workplace, or a routine that required frequent travel nearby. It could also represent a deliberate tactical scouting operation, but the core takeaway remains the same and highly significant. Regardless of the source, this level of familiarity proves the act was calculated. Someone had completed extensive reconnaissance before the attack. This confirms the event was targeted, not some impulsive accident or a case of Nancy being in the wrong place. This was no random encounter at an unlucky moment targeted. That one word completely redefines the scope of this criminal investigation. It shifts the entire investigative strategy, altering the questions being asked, the locations being searched, and the entire suspect pool. A targeted strike is never about a hard evidence is actually there. It is the result of witnesses holding fragments of the truth are reachable and somewhat cooperative, yet the lack of a formal arrest stalls everything. The suspect's ongoing freedom generates a heavy atmosphere of caution, effectively capping what residents are willing to disclose. They hit a wall. They describe the atmosphere or their emotions, but omit the granular, forensic details required. People might gesture toward a suspect, but won't provide names, faces, or specific statements that lead back to them. This artificial limit crippled the detectives. Beneath those truncated interviews and redacted statements, Brian sensed a deeper reality. Beneath the hesitant testimonies, Brian detected the hard edges of a specific truth that witnesses were hiding. The anecdotal evidence teased a conclusion without fully committing. The consistency was undeniable. The patterns were forming. A shared realization existed among the neighbors. They had witnessed something significant and were struggling under that secret burden. They lacked the courage to breach that wall of caution. They needed total assurance that their words would trigger a result, remain confidential, and actually change the outcome of the homicide investigation for the better. Brian recognized that this quiet resistance was a diagnostic signal. It was not a dead end for him. It proved that deeper secrets existed, suggesting that the most critical evidence remained buried just out of reach. The right environment for a breakthrough had not been established yet. The town held more knowledge than they, disclosed, that suppressive force remained active, implying the individual responsible for the crime. Harder questions aimed at a specific decision or movement will eventually force the truth to the surface. Such answers are exactly what the perpetrator worked to hide. This specific pressure point had not yet been pinpointed with total certainty, but the data suggested it was hidden deep within the sequence. It exists between the initial surveillance phase and the attack itself. It was a moment of behavioral shift where a previously consistent pattern of movement suddenly showed a slight, telling irregularity. Maybe it was a delay or a slight detour from the route established during his prior scouting missions. This minor detail only emerges when viewing the entire timeline as one connected forensic dataset. Breaking the case meant looking at the whole picture instead of isolated moments. That was the precise reality on the ground, the point where this investigation finally stood its ground. Brian Entin's labor finally yielded results, forcing scattered forensic fragments into sharp alignment. Isolated data points, the eyewitness accounts, surveillance footage, and profile analysis stopped being separate threads entirely. Even the local silence began connecting into a pattern, though it failed to provide a total, airtight solution. Every lingering question remained, yet the actual silhouette of this crime was becoming undeniably more visible. The trajectory of the suspect was sharpening, and that recurring vehicle description was finally gaining tactical definition. What was once a vague description shifted into a specific category, while the critical time windows tightened. Independent accounts began to overlap and narrow, focusing on the specific geographic area where activity occurred. The perimeter was defining itself. No single fact solved the mystery, but together they gained lethal momentum. The detectives had struggled for years, but now the evidence was finally pointing toward a target. Having a direction, even an imprecise one, is a world away from the total void of a cold lead. A focal point provides a center of gravity, allowing investigators to demand answers to highly specific questions. They no longer faced an infinite field of theories. They finally possessed a strategic direction to pursue. This movement relied on forensic facts rather than mere assumption or reckless guesswork. The facts regarding Nancy Guthrie's fate weren't fully reconstructed yet, but the pieces were finally fitting together. That distinction is critical because the long history of cold case files and high-stakes criminal investigations proves it. Cases that stall only to break open years later usually follow this exact path of slow, forensic alignment. Major breakthroughs rarely happen because of one dramatic moment. They occur through the heavy accumulation of detail. A methodical investigator takes the existing fragments and forces them to connect through sheer clinical persistence and logic. He worked until the structure was undeniable, while the watchful community monitored Brian Entin's every forensic move. There was no loud, frantic media circus